Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Tokyo College webinar. My name is Naoko HOSOKAWA, Postdoctoral Fellow at Tokyo College, and I'll be moderating the event today. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor John Lee. Professor Lee is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He has written extensively on social theory, political economy, comparative race and ethnicity, and East Asia. His books include Modern Peoplehood, as well as The Dream of East Asia and Japan, The Sustainable Society. Professor Lee will be giving us a talk entitled The Global Environmental Catastrophe, Limits of Scientific Knowledge. Professor Lee's lecture will be followed by comments from Professor Kohei Saito. Professor Saito is an associate professor at the University of Tokyo. He's a specialist in economic and social thought and the youngest and first Japanese recipient of the prestigious Deutsche Memorial Prize for his monograph, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, Capital, Nature, and Unfinished Critique of Political Economy. He was also awarded the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science Prize for his research on Marx, as well as Chuo Koron Shinsha's New Book Prize for his bestseller, Das Kapital in Anthropocene. At the end of the lecture, questions from the audience will be answered. So if you have any question you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A function to submit your question at any time during the lecture. Let me also remind you that there is a language button at the bottom of the screen. So if you'd like to listen to this lecture in Japanese, please click on Japanese for the live English to Japanese interpretation. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Lee. Professor Lee, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'd like to thank, before we begin, staff at Tokyo College, especially Director Haneda, for making my stay here both pleasurable and productive. Screen, please. What I like to talk about today is the question of global climate catastrophe. Next slide, please. I think there are many questions one could pose on this topic, and there are at least two that will come to many people's mind. First has to do with the causes and consequences of global environmental crisis. What are the major causes? What are the likely consequences? What should we be doing? I will not be answering this question, and I will simply take it as axiomatic that there is a massive environmental crisis it's ongoing now and will surely worsen and exacerbate over the next 2 decades. The question I hope to answer is a very different question. It has to do with the paradox that increasingly we are aware that there's a huge risk and danger associated with the environmental crisis. And yet at the same time, without denying efforts by various groups of people and organizations, that there is not much attention and not much action to ameliorate, if not avert, the crisis. What I hope to do is to convince you of 2 arguments I'll be making, which are my answers to this question. Now, there are many different ways one could answer this question. It could be that humanity has a propensity toward instinctive inaction. We know that, for example, when planes crash, most passengers sit still, frozen. And there are, of course, larger political and economic factors, the power of corporations, government, and so on, that impede and at times avert efforts to ameliorate the situation. These are important and true, but what I hope to do is to focus on a different aspect, an aspect that has not, by and large, been aired. And that has to do with limitations of scientific knowledge. that there are inherent limits to the way we can approach this crisis that will rely solely on scientific knowledge. And second, and related, that we need to cultivate utopian imagination to tackle an existential crisis for humanity. Now, I want to allay your fear that I am somehow anti-science or anti-technology. I am not particularly. I don't think there's any question that modern and contemporary science provide the most reliable, the most powerful, and most prestigious way of knowing that we possess. It's an epistemic system that is non-parallel in many ways. Now, there are many ways in which we could say why it is that science is so reliable and powerful. Some will turn to the fact that it achieves logical coherence by means of mathematical formulations and equations. Yet others will talk about the fact that scientists engage in systematic empirical investigation. Now, I think these are both true, but what I hope to stress is a different point, namely that science is perhaps the most anti-authoritarian system of knowledge that we have, that we believe in scientific hypotheses and theorems and laws, not because God said so, not because some powerful person, king, emperor, what have you, said so, not because some rich person said so, but because scientists engaged in systematic inquiry have come to democratic consensus about what is true, what is right, thereby jettisoning and discarding old, wrong hypotheses and proposing and accepting new ones. That is to say, science is remarkable because it's systematically corrigible, meaning that it corrects itself. It is anti-authoritarian, not, again, in the sense that they don't simply accept these ideas, not because a famous University of Tokyo professor like SAITO said something is true, but because people have thought and tested various ideas. And I would also add that one of the wonders of scientific knowledge is the technological marvels, wonders that have issued based on scientific progress. This very event would be impossible without technological and scientific advances. The televisual technology, and of course, the internet to disseminate it, and of course, previous to that, electricity and other scientific advances that made modern life possible. I mean, all this is in many ways a wonder, one of the glories of humanity. And yet, when we come to the question of environmental crisis, we cannot forget that it's the very science and technology that has been one of the major causes of natural destruction and the environmental crisis. Now, there are many, many culprits here. We can talk about governments, corporations, our human nature, perhaps, but there's no question, however greedy humanity can be, however greedy corporations can be, the extent of destruction would have been far limited were it not for developments in science and technology. The question always comes down to who will educate these educators, these authorities with which we deal with. So the argument I am making is that as wonderful as science and technology have been, there are inherent limitations to this form of knowledge. And in particular, I want to focus on its belatedness, or the slow process by which knowledge emerges. Let me use as an example a series of reports by IPCC. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have issued periodic assessment reports. The first one came out in 1990. There have been 6 of them, the last one in 2021. Now, they're considered to be the gold standard of knowledge, scientific knowledge on the environmental crisis that we face. Now, if you read through these reports, what's remarkable is that in each report, they project the worst case scenario as well as the best case scenario. But for each report, by and large, by the time next report appears, the best case scenario was the previous report's worst case scenario, meaning that the worst case scenarios keep on becoming exacerbated. They are getting worse. And the punchline of this, for example, would be the fact that the very fact of global warming was only acknowledged to be scientifically more or less true with the third report in 2011. It took 20 years for scientists to come to this consensus. Now, you might say that the problem may just be that the problem is accelerating, that things are getting much, much worse. Or it could be that scientists are simply engaged in justifiable caution. I mean, why would you wish to throw caution to the wind and simply accept something because some scientists said so? Certainly, you would not want to be the first to try a new vaccine. You want vaccines to be tested and so on. So as I keep on insisting, it's just the human marvel that we've managed to generate so much knowledge scientifically and to create so much technological progress. There is no question that these are wonderful things, and yet there are at least 3 ways in which scientific knowledge moves slowly. The first form of resistance, as I call it, has to do with the extensive division of scientific labor. I mean, that is to say, scientific progress depends on disciplinary specialization. Each scientist, be it natural or social, usually looks at a very, very, very small subfield and tries to make an advance to push that proverbial envelope of the knowledge on the particular area. There's nothing wrong with this. Modern science would be impossible without division of labor. And yet, when we come to a problem like the environment, which is perforce about nature and about the human world, we come to a serious problem because one of the fundamental divides in the sciences is that between nature, study of nature, and study of humanity, natural sciences and social sciences. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with dividing the way we generate knowledge this way, but what happens when we come to something like the environmental crisis, which is a co-production of nature and humanity? And indeed, the very concept of the environment in which I'm using, in which you're familiar with, only emerged in the course of late 1940s and became a major topic of study beginning in the 1970s. The second problem is a related one, that scientists perforce engage in analysis usually by differentiating the problem they look at. They usually reduce it to certain variables and look at something very, very small. And this is a wonderful intellectual move. What scientists are less good at, however, are tasks of synthesis and integration, looking at larger phenomena. And there's no question that something like the environment, which is large, ineffable, hard to define, that overlaps nature and society, is something hard to look at, hard to understand, hard to make it into an object of study. But to illustrate this point, let me come up with a slightly different example that comes from the social sciences. Now, all of you watching this video are aware that there are serious issues about domestic violence usually violence against women, and sexual harassment, again, unfortunately, against women. These are widely recognized problems. And yet, when we look at the history of social sciences, these two concepts, these two categories, did not emerge as objects of study until the 1970s. In many ways, something like violence against women, something like sexual harassment, must have existed since the beginning of humanity 200,000 years ago. It is kind of a trans-historical or trans-cultural universal. And yet it's only in the last 40 to 50 years that we have studied them, we have done interview data, we have ethnographic observations, we collected now statistical data, now there are legal frameworks and decisions to undergird this phenomena to the point where none of you, I think, deny that these are serious social evils that need to be studied and dealt with. But again, precisely because it is large, ineffable, and into this point, they were hard to fathom. The third point is something that I mentioned earlier. That scientific validation, because it is not authoritarian, it needs to be validated by peers, use systems like peer review that perforce take time. But the problem is exacerbated when a field is relatively new. There aren't that many experts. There are very few established guidelines and norms. There are very few commonly acknowledged knowledge. And in newfangled areas, especially interdisciplinary ones, like environmental studies, it takes a long time for environmental knowledge to be accepted by scientists, community of scientists. Now, in most instances, as I will say, this is not a problem. Science should be cautious. It cannot but be cautious. But what if the problem is accelerating? What if the problem is truly existential in character? Next slide, please. I think the problem is exacerbated in part because there is a form of utopian ideology called techno-utopianism or techno-scientific utopianism that takes for granted arrogance that science is the only way to knowledge, that scientific hubris has become a major belief system among some people. In the case of environmental issues, please come back to me. In the case of environmental studies, there are serious scientists who engage in studies of bacteria and fungi that will consume carbon dioxide. There are others who are engaged in the construction of filtration system that will suck up carbon dioxide. Yet other scientists wish to seed particles into atmosphere, into clouds, and reflect back the sun ray to cool planet Earth. And yet others are seriously considering efforts to terraform, that is to say, establish colonies in the moon, on Mars perhaps, or in interstellar space. Now, I'm not against any of these research. I mean, we should do all we can, the more the merrier. And yet, why is it that for many people, the solution to the environmental catastrophe is more science and more technology? Let me use an example with which all of you are familiar. The COVID-19 pandemic. It changed the world, as it were, and pretty much stopped the world as it was from 2020 to 2022. And in some way, it hasn't ended, but we wish that it did. Now, there's a huge amount of discussion on COVID-19, as you know. And one of the more popular topics of discussion is the etiology, the cause or origin of this pandemic, COVID-19. And one of the most popular hypotheses is that SARS-CoV-2, the virus, leaked from a Chinese lab in Wuhan. Now, I don't know if this is true or not. I tend to be skeptical. But what I do know is that COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. A zoonotic disease is a disease that spills over from an animal species to human beings. And we know, again, through scientific research, the fundamental dynamic of zoonotic disease, which is natural destruction wrought by human beings as we destroy wildlife habitats, like a jungle, for example. Animals that used to reside happily in the jungle have to come outside to forage for food, to seek new shelter. And in so doing, they bring with them the virus that had been lodging in these animals. And they come into contact with human beings, and the virus, as it were, spills over, jumps to human beings, thereby generating disease, epidemics, and pandemics. Indeed, almost all the major epidemics one can think of in the last several decades are examples of zoonotic disease, Ebola, for example. And what's interesting about this is that from my way of thinking, COVID-19 pandemic was part and parcel of the environmental crisis because it's the natural destruction of wildlife habitat that caused this in the proximate instance. And yet, though there are millions of tweets and blogs and exchanges about Chinese lab leak theory, the discussion of COVID-19 as a zoonotic disease is far and few in between, and very few people, as far as I can tell, discuss COVID-19 as a consequence of the environmental crisis. Let me go on with this example. I'm sorry to pound over again and again, but if you look at one of the most interesting reports published in 2019, the Global Health Security Index, what it tried to do was to rank countries on their preparedness for an oncoming epidemic or pandemic. The United States came in #1. That is to say, according to the scientists who compiled this index, it was the most prepared country for the next epidemic or pandemic, followed closely by the United Kingdom. Now, many of you will disagree which country fared the worst during the pandemic, but there is no question in my mind that US did not do very well with over 1 million deaths. May not have fared the worst, but it was one of the worst. And United Kingdom was easily the worst performer, as it were, in the EU. Now, why is it that compilers of this index got the country ranking so wrong? Were they bad scientists? Were they not professionals? I think that's not the problem. The problem is rather what I just mentioned earlier, which is the regnant division of intellectual labor in which natural phenomena are separated from cultural, social, political, and economic. And I think there's no question, whether you love the previous Prime Minister of UK or the previous US president, that they probably didn't do as well as they should have in stemming the spread of COVID-19. I mean, that is to say, we cannot just rely on technology and science. And this is underscored by the fact that as important as vaccines that were invented very quickly and disseminated very widely were, there's no question that before and even during and after vaccination, so-called medieval solutions, these ancient practices of social isolation, social distancing, and mask wearing were crucial to stemming the spread of this particular disease. That is to say, science by itself is not adequate. And though, as I keep on saying, ecological destruction is a consequence of techno-scientific advances, we tend by and large to look for the destroyer, as it were, to become the savior of the crisis. So what I'm trying to say is that science is not enough. And yet the social sciences, I'm a social scientist, is bedeviled in their own way by what I call scientism, or an effort to become something just like natural science or physics. One of the most prestigious, perhaps the most prestigious of science is economics, neoclassical economics. And I think one of the reasons is that it reifies and proposes as a universal principle human rationality, that calculations of costs and benefit, utility calculation can be mathematically formulated. We can have this wonderful edifice of mathematical equations. And political scientists, sociologists, and others have emulated this, trying to suggest that rational choice, utility calculation, is at the foundation of human behavior. Now, this is a long story, and I'm not going to spend a lecture saying why I think this is problematic, as much as I respect rational choice theorizing. And let me just give you an example of a book published in 1965 called The Logic of Collective Action by Mansur Olson. I was reminded of this book because about 10 days ago, Asahi Shimbun, one of the great Japanese newspapers, had a long spread on this book published long ago. What Olson argues, and I simplify a great deal, is that to understand collective action, one needs to understand individuals' utility calculation. The cost of joining collective action, a social movement, is large. It takes time, takes effort, and you might even get arrested if you should join a demonstration. And yet the benefits tend to be very, very hard to figure out and long time in coming. So there's an inherent tendency for human beings, so Olson argued, to free ride, to just do nothing. And yet, if we look at this date, year 1965, and think about world history, decade or so after 1965, you will realize this is a decade of almost unprecedented effervescence of collective action or social movement. The student movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the feminist movement, LGBTQ movement, and of course the environmental movement either saw birth or major renaissance in the decade or so following 1965. Now, this doesn't disprove rational choice theory or Olson's theory in any particular way, but it should provide a prima facie case for thinking that maybe there is something problematic. I want you to see me, I guess, being kind of an old-fashioned person. It's useful to look at the speaker's expression, gesticulation, and whatnot. Again, I'm not going to make a long argument about the foundations of social science, but I will take it as a given, it's the topic of my next book, about the primacy of routines, habits, and the power of norms by family, friends, your networks, and organization in making us behave in a particular way. That is to say, we actually do not go around choosing from morning to night, day after day. Much of human life is routinized. It's a product of habituation. You would believe this if you should ever go to a bookstore and see rows and rows of books on diet. I mean, if it were a matter of choosing, we wouldn't need books on diet. We would simply just decide to diet. Why is it so difficult? From the choice theoretic perspective, it seems to be a matter of acrasia, weakness of will. We just don't have the resolve. We don't have the will to not eat as much, exercise more, or whatever. And yet, I think this is not the exception, but rather more of the rule. Think of your everyday life. You wake up, you go to work, you go to school, come home, eat dinner perhaps. If you're Japanese, probably take a bath, and you go to sleep. Now, do you choose to go to sleep? Put it differently, can you will yourself to sleep? And the answer is effectively no. I have never met anyone who could will her or himself to sleep. I mean, you can certainly do other things, exercise during the day, take sleeping pill, but by and large, it's not a matter of choice in that moment-to-moment sense. Or take something much more momentous in most people's biography, the fact or phenomena of falling in love. Now, with the rise of matchmaking applications, these wonderful sites that you get, there's an illusion that you can choose. But you cannot, as far as I know, choose to fall in love. It just more or less happens. And I think these are just two instances, I guess three, of the general topic about how human behavior is neither particularly active choosing, for example, nor particularly just passive. The binary that is said to be discrete, active or passive, misleads us into thinking that we either do something, that we are active, or that something is done to us, that we are passive. When in point of fact, active, passive provide a continuum, a large swathe of what I would call the middle voice, in which it's a combination of different things. So, for example, the book I'm writing based on this lecture, I hope the book sells. But to say the book sells doesn't mean the book goes around selling itself. But it's also not the case that the book is simply being sold in this passive sense. There's a lot of things going on that makes a book sell. And that's what I mean by the middle voice. And if you go beyond the social sciences to these hoary old classics, like Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, talking about hexes and the importance of habituation in character formation, or Zhuangzi, the great Chinese philosopher, on how a craft person becomes habituated into making pottery or something, they avoid the extremes of the active and passive and focus squarely on this vast realm of habit or the middle voice. Related to this, then, is the question, if in fact, if so much of human livelihood, if so much of our lives are governed by habits and norms, how do we make a change? How do we make that jump? And here I want to propose the epistemic principle of love. Love, not so much in the sense of romantic love, much closer to the Christian notion of agape, love for family, friends, and so on. When you fall in love, as I am sure that all of you have, it could be a person, could be a dog, it could even be a book. The object of what you regard, the person, the dog, the book, changes. The person seems more wonderful, the more perfect. The dog seems cuddlier, cuter. And the book seems just replete with great insights, when if you had just passed by them a week ago, you'd have saw just another person, just another dog, just another book. And in so doing, by falling in love, the world transforms. The world becomes, as it were, a slightly better place, brighter, happier. You know, it's just a wonderful thing. And this is because falling in love provides us a new perspective, a new way of looking at not just the object, but the world. There's a wonderful phrase in Thomas Aquinas, a much maligned medieval philosopher, in his commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, where he says, ubi amor, ibi oculus, meaning simply, where there is love, there is vision. Or perhaps where there is love, there is the eye. Because you love this thing, the person, the dog, the book, you begin to see all sorts of things. And you begin to appreciate the world in a different way. And this is, as I say, a counterfactual in the sense that it doesn't really exist, right? So to go back to the earlier example I gave of domestic violence and sexual harassment, it's because feminist philosophers and social scientists, activists, fell in love with the notion, ideal, vision of gender equality, a position from which they could see all sorts of things that used to be just normal, something that we accepted as part and parcel of everyday life. And this is true not just for gender equality, but almost all aspects of humanity. If you take a phenomena like slavery, it was something of a trans-historical, trans-cultural universal. It's hard to look for a civilization that never had slavery. And yet, in the course of 18th, 19th century, humanity fell in love with the idea of human equality, belief in human dignity, and even belief in human or racial equality, later on human rights, and could no longer countenance the degradation of fellow human beings. We cannot, even though some people argue, economic historians Fogel and Engerman argue that slavery was a reasonably efficient economic system. And even if economists could prove today that slavery would be a wonderfully efficient way to run a capitalist enterprise, Professor Saito might say that many factories are like that, but nonetheless, slavery is something that we cannot condone. Our love for this vision, our moral stand, makes this impossible. And this is because there is a principle that I call explanatory symmetry, that by falling in love with this object, you care, you have concern for, and you respect this thing that you are studying. When I was learning the social sciences a long time ago, in the 1970s and 80s, the idea that human beings, Homo sapiens sapien, were the greatest thing in the universe was taken for granted. We were superior, we were so much better than everything else, animals, plants, what have you. So I had to read books about how, for example, human beings are the only animals that can communicate. We are Homo locans, or talking animals. There were books saying that we human beings are the only ones that can think, engage in higher cognitive activity. We are Homo cogitans. We're also the only animal that can use tools, man the tool using animal. And yet in the course of the last 3 decades, as biologists, anthropologists, and others have begun to study animals and the natural world with care, concern, and respect, they've come to realize that other animals communicate, and not just dolphins. Plants, trees in the forest communicate through chemical and other signals. We are not the only animals that can think. And based on my observation of my neighborhood crow, certainly birds can use tools to forage for food, build shelter, and so on. It's not an observation that I made up, but biologists have also talked about how crows are extremely intelligent and other birds can use tools as well. That is to say, we need, and as many of us have, we need to fall in love with nature. Now, this is a photo that many of you are familiar with. It was taken from Apollo 8, the first human-made object to orbit the moon. And in so doing, for the first time, human beings were able to see not the sunrise, not the moonrise, but the Earthrise. Bill Anders was a photographer, and he captured this one serene moment. And many people felt, when they saw this photo, the splendor of the planet on which we live. The multicolored blue, the red, the green, the white, this panoply of beautiful color floating against a large, dark, and seemingly cold and indifferent universe. That is to say, it was beautiful, even sublime, but it's more than that. People not only fell in love with planet Earth because of its beauty, its singularity, its interconnectedness, but because it seems so fragile. It's this one thing floating in the vast expanse of space. Perhaps we need to take care of it. And so we come to the fact that we needed this example of utopian imagination. This is exceedingly non-scientific, this idea of one interconnected planet. It's not something that you learn by doing scientific research. And it's not an accident. I think that it's precisely around 1968 the environment movement really began afoot. And again, I want to stress that we live with all sorts of utopian ideas and visions. And what that enables us to do, for example, using the example of human equality, is that we no longer say that it's a matter of nature. It's just too bad that God or nature made human beings in such a way that some people are fated to be slaves. Some people were just destined to be homeless. Some others are just poor and starving. And we increasingly begin to understand them as matters of injustice, something we can do something about because we care about these people, these ideas. So we think nothing now about proposing social policies, economic policies to ameliorate the lot of the poor. We disallow, make illegal slavery, extreme manifestations of exploitation, and so on. That is to say, no longer are these things matters of fate, but matters of politics and human action. And that's precisely what has been happening, and we need to do more of in terms of the environment. So we need a new perspective from which to understand and view reality and to act upon it. We need to inculcate and encourage new habits, norms, and ideals of sustainability, environment, and so on. And indeed, it's precisely because of this that, whereas if you went to the United States 50 years ago, highways, freeways were littered. They were full of garbage, but people try not to destroy the environment that way. Of course, freeways is not the best example because they contribute to environmental degradation. But this is also why we have recycled. Of course, people recycle for all sorts of reasons. They may fear the disapprobation of neighbors and friends, but many people make this into a habit, a simple norm. It's hard to think about not doing it. Now, I think it doesn't take the distinguished commentator to say that, well, this sounds a little bit too idealistic. After all, we know now that much of what had been recycled in global north had been sent to China until about 5 years ago. So all the Americans and Chinese carefully sort these recycled materials, and they're simply shipped off to China until about 5 years ago. Chinese got sick of being the dumping ground for recycled materials. So now we send to other poor countries. And indeed, in Japan, actually, we know that they are simply used as fuels for electricity. That is to say, they're burned, all these carefully recycled materials. My response is slightly different. How do we know that? We know these abuses precisely because there are environmentally conscious and active journalists, activists, and even employees within these companies that cannot countenance these horrible abuses of nature. And no matter how much we try to say governments and corporations bear the brunt, we cannot but think about changing the world without changing people in these places of power and influences. In general, that is, to take a leaf from the great sociologist C. Wright Mill's idea of the sociological imagination, we need to transmogrify these small concerns into public issues. So the punchline is a very simple one. We cannot live without science and technology. We should certainly encourage research on efforts to scientifically and technologically ameliorate and avert the environmental crisis, but they're limited in and of themselves. We need to cultivate utopian imagination and to disseminate environmental consciousness that will make future possible. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for this very inspiring talk, also very encouraging to all of us who are in different fields of discipline. And we confirm the importance of collaboration in science and also importance of love. So here now we will hand over to Professor Saito, who will be giving us some thoughts on this topic. Professor Saito, floor is yours.
Hi, yeah. So, Professor, thank you so much for your inspiring lecture. I really enjoyed listening to it. And also I was very encouraged because my background is Marxian economics. And what I have been doing is basically sort of pointing out the limitation of the mainstream neoclassical economics and also the kind of the techno-optimism under capitalism. But I will also advocate for the necessity to cultivate the utopian imagination, which I call degrowth communism, as a kind of the countermeasure against climate crisis that we are facing now. So I'm very glad that you basically proved or demonstrated why that kind of approach is necessary, and so I really enjoyed learning these things. And I have 3 questions because I want to know a little bit more about what you have explained. So the first thing is, your lecture is about, on the one hand, this worsening of climate crisis, which is today quite obvious. I mean, pretty much everyone agrees with it, but there's this paradox that despite this worsening condition, there aren't enough actions and even attention. And this problem is quite serious in Japan. I'm active also in the climate crisis movement and climate justice movement, but the problem is always this, in the kind of conservative societies like Japan, the movements are quite small, and I'm often frustrated. So, I mean, your lecture is more about kind of the general problem of science and technology and the lack of utopian imagination, which leads to this kind of the general inattention and inaction everywhere. I agree. I mean, even in the US and Europe, there aren't enough action against climate change. And that's why people like Greta Thunberg are quite angry. But at the same time, there are some, of course, like local, regional differences. And it seems to me, regions like East Asia, Japan, Korea, and China is more characterized by inattention and inaction with regard to this environmental problem. So here's one report about the recent research about the Japanese young people, and the number of those who actually believe that their life will be affected more by climate crisis in the future, the number is actually decreasing in Japan among the young generation. And they are also less and less interested in this issue of climate crisis. And that creates the problem, because when people are not interested in climate crisis, the politicians and corporations also don't care. So this is kind of like a vicious circle and so on. But since you are expert of East Asia, I mean, you write extensively on East Asia as a region. So I'm wondering if you have some explanations more about the particularities and more of reasons why this kind of inaction and inattention seems more prevailing in East Asia, especially countries like Japan. I think you realized because you were here for a while. And my second thing is about limitation of science. And I think in addition to limitation of science, I have been emphasizing the limitation of economic growth. And then once you talk about the number of the deaths in the US because of the COVID-19, and you reach to the point of this contradiction of the GDP, because America is obviously the richest country in the world if it's measured by GDP, but the death rate under the COVID-19 is quite high. And this is one of the paradoxes that GDP cannot measure. And the US is rich, but the health system is quite poor and so on. And what I have been problematizing is this problem that, many people are actually falling in love with technology and falling in love with economic growth. But the main problem is basically capitalism not only exploits workers, but such a system also exploits nature. And the history of capitalism is not simply characterized by the development of new technologies and the overcoming disease, poverty, and hunger, and so on, but it's also a system of exploitation, oppression, and destruction of nature, and characterized by imperialism, racism, patriarchy, and environmental destruction. So in my view, capitalism is not a solution, and it is rather a root cause of the polycrisis in the Anthropocene. And the other obvious thing is that infinite growth up on this finite planet is obviously not possible. And if we continue the kind of the investment in green energies and green technologies, I think it will worsen the kind of the exploitation or unequal exchange between the global north and south. The global south have to provide a lot of rare metals and other resources for the excessive production and consumption in the global north. And so this is the reason why it's a very short, but it's one of the main reasons why I'm advocating for degrowth. The degrowth is basically about the GDP is no longer the appropriate measure for progress and development. And we also need to sort of limit economic growth if we really care about the current ecological crisis. And we have to evaluate other aspects of life that have not been measured by GDP and so on. So, I'm just very curious. How do you think about this idea of degrowth as a new kind of the utopian imagination that you mentioned in the end of your lecture? We need a new perspective. We need to, have all sorts of utopian ideas and visions. And I think the degrowth is especially the kind of the hot idea, especially in Europe, but I believe that it's not as common in the US, I guess. So I'm very curious how you think about it and how people in the US think about this idea of the degrowth. And my third question is about the difficulty that I have when I try to overcome the narrowness of modern science. And I really like the expression of falling in love. The ecological consciousness is really falling in love with nature. I think we need that moment of awakening. I think people should go to nature a little bit more often. That, it's the best way to cultivate. It's just reading books about climate change or reading IPCC report doesn't really make you ecologically conscious. I think you need to have some more contact with nature. So in that sense, ecological consciousness is not just about science. It's about, spirituality, if I use the term often used by ecofeminists. But this, when I use this expression of spirituality and the importance of spirituality, like a non-scientific feeling and so on, I get, of course, some criticism and negative reactions from those who are more falling in love with science and the modern science. But that's fine. I mean, that's something that occurs. But my problem is often those people who are sharing the similar kind of spirituality, like, for example, people who are working in organic farmers are doing something important, I believe. But at the same time, they can be quite patriarchal and they love the mother nature, right? So, I mean, they can be quite nationalistic. They want to protect the land and that, they protect the Japanese land and so on. It's quite nationalistic. And often they can be quite anti-scientific even, we love nature, so we don't care about the vaccines. We don't do, it's just vaccines are dangerous and so on. And when it comes to that kind of point, I also have some hesitation, and we have some difficulty communicating and make an alliance because I am also a university professor, and I obviously belong to the community of this science. Science is anti-authoritarian, you said, but at the same time, I profit from various kinds of authority that this, for example, the University of Tokyo offers and so on. So I can't really say, the vaccines are bad, it's dangerous, we should be more spiritual, love nature and so on. So that's not something that I want to do. So I think there's some inherent tension when we try to overcome the narrowness of the modern science, and when we try to integrate the more utopian aspect. So what should we actually pay attention to, and how we can actually overcome this narrowness? And that's what I'm interested in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Saito. Yes, Professor Lee, do you have responses? There are a lot of provoking questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Saito, for your very penetrating questions. Let me answer briefly in the interest of time. I actually hate when lecturer talks about the previous book. It's like a commercial, but in my previous book, Japan, the Sustainable Society, I actually talked a great deal about this tradition that is very much alive in contemporary Japan that probably began to effloresce sometime during the Tokugawa or Edo period about craft consciousness, including something that Japanese people, ordinary Japanese people still use, such as the phrase "mottainai," that you don't want to waste things. And it's kind of exemplified by someone that most people would not associate with the environmental movement, Kondo Marie, or the triage guru. You get rid of things. It's a form of personal degrowth to achieve quality of life and fulfillment. Now, I'm quite aware, as Professor Saito says, that contemporary Japan is not such a wonderful place from the standpoint of environmentally conscious person. But we need to sustain, revive, and use these things that are, if not quite inherent in Japanese life, used to be a very, very important part and remains still vibrant. And I think every society, every civilization has something like that. I'm somewhat skeptical of revolutions only because something new cannot just emerge ex nihilo, out of the blue. We need, if possible, cultivate things that are already there. So to the second question about degrowth, in fact, I'm sorry to do something I hate. Chapter 2 of the book on Japan was chapter on against growth. The growth is one of the fundamental ideologies, I think, not just of economics, but of social sciences. We cannot think about social policy without growth because you want a positive sum game, more and more things to distribute, not a zero sum, and certainly not a negative sum game. And yet, given the examples that Professor Saito mentioned himself, I think more people are acutely aware that these reified numbers, these numerics called GDP, are far from expressing kind of quality of life that we experience in everyday life. I live in San Francisco, by many measures, the wealthiest city in the world, certainly a city with the highest rent in the world. And yet, even though one is relatively privileged, living in a nice neighborhood, it is hard, if you're not all that conscious, to be inundated by homeless people, drug addicts, and so on. And so it's hard not to cultivate some sense that individual is the answer, growth is the answer. And so just to agree in general with Professor Saito's sentiment, that there's a growing recognition that this is in fact the case. And ironically, I think it's weakest among social scientists or professional social scientists. The third point, which is related, I think is in part, of course, I wish very much that Professor Saito's book, although I guess his book became a bestseller, so I should speak just for myself, would sell, that people would pay attention, and so on. But the proximate audience would obviously be students, would be social scientists, and possibly younger fellow social scientists. And here, I think it's very important to remember the nature of social sciences not so long ago. It's actually not as bad, I think, in Japan. Maybe the grass is greener on the other side, but there are professors, not just Professor Saito, who write for the larger reading public and write environmental books that become bestsellers. In the US, it wasn't uncommon 50 years ago, 70 years ago, for leading scientists, natural scientists, social scientists to write books for the public. But this is so rare now. And this is part and parcel of our specialized, professionalized social science. To use the Aquinas example again, medieval philosopher, one of the wonderful arguments he had with his fellow philosopher was whether it's adequate for a theologian to simply write for other theologians. And Aquinas says, actually, that's not. Without enlightenment, without disseminating one's argument, one's knowledge, one's science is almost useless. And it's an ethos that I think we have lost in the professionalized social sciences, certainly in the US and increasingly in the world, precisely because of pressure to publish in professional journals and so on. And so here, at least, I think Japan is in much better condition. But I'm afraid, as Monkasho Ministry of Education seeks to raise the ranking of universities under the Ray 5 metric, that they will look down upon popularizers, people who try to enlighten the public, whereas I think it's an extremely important, extremely crucial aspect of our job description as professional scientists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Professor Saito, do you have reaction to these answers?
Yeah, I mean, Monkasho sucks. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions from the audience, so I will introduce some of them to ask you, to Professor Lee. So there's a question. Thank you for your wonderful interdisciplinary lecture. Some people will argue that falling in love with nature is not enough, just as some economists have argued that slavery was abolished because it was not sustainable economically, rather than love of humanity. How can we act on a global political and economic level based on love with nature? So this might be combined with some of my thoughts as well, if I may add some. You mentioned this love with nature, which really struck me as well. But also you mentioned that falling in love with something not controllable, it's not our choice. And if it's over other people, it's even less of our own choice. So what can we do as a researcher or even as a member of this world? How can we try to act on this love with nature or love with the earth to react on this global crisis? So would you have any response to this question?
Sure, thank you for the question. By saying that we should fall in love with nature, I was making an argument about an epistemic principle. It's not a scientific, rational one, but an extra scientific one. And though that's the case, it makes possible scientific advances. We study animals, environment, and all sorts of things. So I was asserting its cardinal role that's often overlooked in discussion in the philosophy of sciences. Quite obviously, falling in love is not enough. I mean, as I say, all of you must have fallen in love with another person, dog. Very often it doesn't go very well because love is not enough, right? If you want to make marriage, for example, work, you can't just say, I love you, I love you, I love you. Perhaps you should wash dishes. Perhaps you should clean the floor. Perhaps you should listen to your spouse. All sorts of things that are obvious to some people, but they become possible because of love. I mean, these are subsequent questions. And I'm not saying that falling in love is enough. It's just a condition of possibility for change, just like love into marriage. It's not enough to say that I love you. So for social scientists, again, we can only do so much as individuals. We do what we can. Yes, some people might want to become saints for nature. You may want to be a kamikaze for nature and so on. But I'm against rather radical, revolutionary, or violent approaches, precisely because they are, A, not all that effective. If I go around trying to save electricity by turning off light switch everywhere, if I start screaming at everyone in Japan, carrying these portable phones because you're wasting electricity, I think I'm not likely to convince that person for the environmental cause. I'm likely to put off that person for being more environmentally conscious. At a deeper level, you have your domains. So as a social theorist, which is how I define myself professionally, I write a book, a social theory book on the environment. In some ways, it's just a small effort, but combined with others, with big efforts like Professor Saito's best-selling book, we move the pieces forward. And in this sense, I think it's not good to go from, yes, I have fallen in love, let's be environmental, to wanting to change everything all at once. It's impractical on the one hand, and it's not something that's very conducive to convincing people around you. And yet, it's these small steps, these ordinary virtues that one can inculcate, that one can slowly begin to change. One of the ways in which carbon dioxide emission, global warming, is caused, as you know, is by our extreme reliance on meat consumption. I'm not saying vegetarianism is the answer, but it's certainly an answer. And if you cannot stop eating meat, you could certainly eat less. You could certainly start thinking and reading and discussing about these issues. Now, the time is short. If scientists in this sense are to be believed, we will be facing horrible, horrible crises. But unfortunately, I think we can only, by and large, take one step at a time. Unfortunately, I wish I could jump. Certainly, there are people who can fly, but by and large, for most people, most of the time, I would encourage step-by-step efforts.
Thank you very much for this very encouraging answer as well. And also we understand that this idea of love is an underlying value that can give us more motivation to work on this project. So let me introduce another question. Professor Lee, I really appreciate your very insightful and thought-provoking lecture about the limitation of techno-scientific knowledge in addressing the global environmental crisis. It is indeed concerning that despite widespread knowledge acknowledgement of the crisis, little action has been taken. Your point about the understanding of the crisis raises an important question. Please guide us about what are key factors that have contributed to the delay in recognizing and addressing the severity of the environmental crisis, and how can we bridge the gap between techno-scientific knowledge and non-scientific discussions to ensure more comprehensive approach to solving the environmental crisis?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there are many, many different answers I could provide. From the standpoint of the lecture I gave, for example, global warming, which is only one part of the environmental catastrophe as I think of it, though a very important one. I think the outline was pretty clear to many experts by 1980s, early 80s, if not earlier. And yet, because of the nature of science, without which we cannot move on, it's only in 2011 that IPCC pronounced it as more or less undeniable scientific fact. That's 30 years. And in one calculation, it's in the last 30 to 40 years, we have managed to pump more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than all of human history beforehand. So the problem is exacerbating. Again, my lecture was simply whether we should just rely on scientists to carefully make these pronouncements. Or perhaps we actually need all sorts of people making all sorts of different expressions. So it could be Greta Thunberg in Sweden screaming at people. That's certainly one way. Yet others who tie themselves to trees, I hope some of them will do that, to the ginkgo trees in Jingu, Guyane. It could be others who are scribbling books, like Professor Saito. There could be others, like these comedians in Japan, Warai Geinin, who might make these issues better known. I don't think there's just one solution. It has to be multifaceted. And for you, it could begin easily from family. Maybe you don't talk to your family, but you probably talk to your friends through internet, SNS. And for teachers, increasingly to take on these issues because they impinge on almost everything, whether you teach economics, political science, anthropology, chemistry. Environmental catastrophe impinges on all these fields. So you don't have to become an environmental scientist, but you can begin to incorporate these knowledge and to teach them to do more research if you're so moved. So again, I don't think there's one answer. Just like when you look back on massive changes that happened. I mean, why did slavery end? Right? It's the example I used and that was echoed back. In the case of the US, ended up being a horribly ghastly war. Tragic, devastating in many ways. In the case of Imperial Russia, the Tsar kind of pronounced it, in part because he probably felt Russia was behind other enlightened European countries. There are many different answers, and again, you could argue that it's inefficient, but Fogel and Engelman argue that it was efficient. And it's easy for others who fall in love with this vision of human inequality to reassert all these things. So these battles, if you will, of ideas and research never end. They do come back, right? Racism comes back. Sexism may well come back. Who knows? So we all do our part. And I cannot say more than that to say that as people cultivate their ordinary virtue, these moral convictions about human dignity or environmental consciousness, we have to go through our lives doing what we can, not to give up the way we have lived completely overnight, because again, that's impractical and unlikely to succeed.
Thank you very much for this answer. So we all have a lot of responsibility and role in this. Let me read another question. Perhaps many universities today still offer both science and technology subject and social science subject separately. Do you think combining those subjects into one in such a way that students will be able to apply what they learn in social science subjects to science and technology will help address environmental concerns. I think it also relates to this university system, especially in Japan, when people have this very binary concept of natural science as in rike and social science and humanities as bunke. What do you think about these divisions? Do you think it's useful? As in, you mentioned division of scientific labor is important, but do you think this binary conception, do you think it's important?
Let me put it slightly differently. One of the philosopher or theorists that Professor Saito loves used to say that method of research is different from method of presentation. I mean, meaning that in terms of research, division of labor in many ways is impossible not to have. We need division of labor. Some people need to integrate them, but it's fine for most people to do their small bit, no question. In terms of teaching, however, it is problematic simply to teach about your specialized some small area of research. It's fine to teach that to graduate students, especially if people want to do research in this area, but it's not fine when you teach undergraduates. And I think that earlier generation of scientists, both natural and social, used to have this. One of my favorite anecdotes about University of California, Berkeley, where I teach, is from 67 years ago. Its chemistry department was astounding. I think in the course of 1950s, 7 people won the Nobel Prize. Now that's just one metric, but let's just assume, yes, I want you to assume that there were these great research chemists. And yet, these great research chemists, Nobel Prize winners, used to gather once a week during the term to discuss the content of the next week's introduction to chemistry lecture. And they would actually fight to say who gets to give that lecture. I mean, this is unimaginable today at UC Berkeley because we're all in our small silos and we make, adjuncts usually teach intro courses. But I'm not sure why we cannot revive at least some of the spirit of teaching, whether collective or even individual. In many ways, the most eminent, the most productive person should be teaching introductory courses because in some ways, they're the most important. Any researcher can teach a graduate seminar in some way. But to have that encompassing perspective is something that one should expect. And it's really just a change of ethos. It's hard to overcome because we have unthinkingly changed the way we do things so that researchers only want to teach about what they do research on. But again, I think it's not impossible. It's a small thing. And so one proposal that was mooted was combining team teaching. Sure, let's do more of that. And administrators should make things easier for people to want to cut across disciplinary boundaries, divisions between bunke and dike or whatever. So again, I don't think there's just one solution. But I think here, again, it's wrong to think that Japan in some way is worse off. I think in some ways it's better than the US, where it's increasingly hard to find leading scientists writing an introductory textbook when it was very, very common.
Thank you very much for this encouraging reply. So yeah, I hope what we are doing at Tokyo College as Interdisciplinary Research Center can also offer one of the solutions in terms of the scientific collaboration. So let me read another question. Is listening more to the voices of indigenous people something you would recommend? So this is perhaps related to also what Professor Saito has mentioned. You mentioned that science is the most anti-authoritarian system of knowledge, which I really liked to be take part of such a democratic system of knowledge, which is an amazing thing. But also, as Professor Saito says, universities are authorities, and there are more prestigious universities, and there are less listened institutions of research. So there's differences of this recognition in scientific knowledge or knowledge, human knowledge in general. So this question relates to these indigenous people. So there are obviously things we know less about the nature or the world in general. Would you have some comments about this?
Yeah, I mean, to use, quote, an old person that no one ever reads anymore, Cicero or Cicero, he said, with greater power comes greater responsibility. It's simply a matter of civic duty. It's only what a decent human being should do. That with, say, if you're a Professor Saito at University of Tokyo, he should be aware that he has more responsibility. I mean, of course, whether you teach at college no one has ever heard of, or University of Tokyo, each has responsibility to students, colleagues, to the larger organization, and to the larger profession, perhaps. But I think there is no question that if people who inhabit important purchase, Toda, University of Tokyo in Japan, Harvard, whatever, MIT, Stanford, even Berkeley, have greater responsibility. And I wish I could impress this on my colleagues more, and many of people are aware. But that's all I can say. As for indigenous people, yes, of course. I mean, it's horrible. And we used to do this in the name of science. Sciences of anthropology, sociology, and so on, which asserted that the West was the highest form of civilization. So we should essentially expunge, squelch, destroy indigenous civilization and make them assimilate to civilized nation. Yeah, we are responsible for these horribly imperialistic, horribly racist ideas. Where I would probably not be as keen on indigenous ideas is that as sustainable as they were compared to contemporary industrial societies based on this science and technology, again, it's a double-edged sword. It's a wonderful thing, anti-authoritarian, reliable, powerful, blah, blah, blah. But it also destroys nature like never before. In terms of indigenous cultures, unfortunately, as far as I can make out, many of them were not always that environmentally friendly, unfortunately. And it's only because they didn't have the means of natural destruction that they weren't as efficient in destroying nature. But having said that, with this one caveat, I would say, yes, by and large, indigenous people were or had beliefs that are much more compatible with environmental consciousness, environmentally sustainable way of living. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answer. So I'm afraid that we are out of time. We still have a lot more questions. So we will make sure to send all the questions to Professor Lee. And Professor Saito, do you have the final comments, reaction to the discussion and questions and answers?
Yes, actually, sometimes people misunderstand that when I say, degrowth communism, it's about immediate uprising and changing everything overnight. And in contrast, actually, I agree with what Professor Lee said today. I think many of things must be gradual, and we cannot really transform the system overnight. So I think we have to go through this process of gradual reformation and so on. But at the same time, I want to add that that kind of transformation, the gradual transformation, only occurs with the participation of some more radical people or who demand that kind of the more rapid and urgent transformation of the society. So if everyone gets so relieved and okay, everything becomes so gradual and we cannot change overnight and so on, things will be too slow. I think we have to start with the recognition that climate crisis is quite urgent. We need to really transform everything as soon as possible, even if we know that revolution is not possible. So I think that some people still need to demand ecological revolution. And I think this is exactly the utopian imagination that we direly need today.
Thank you so much, Professor Saito. Professor Lee, do you have final remark on this?
No, thank you so much for hosting this event, for giving me wonderful comments and questions. And I hope that this will spur you into greater consciousness and even action about making future possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm sure it will. So thank you once again, Professor Lee and Professor Saito, for this wonderful discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope to see you at the next event. Thank you. And bye.